Lesson 53, Making New Species. We will learn how evolution explains speciation. Now, speciation is a new word, and we're not going to probably go through all of speciation today. We're probably just going to go through the start of it, and then I've got maybe some questions that I'm going to get you guys to do. But yeah, we're going to start talking about speciation. I've got another one of my little animation sort of things that I've made today just to sort of really illustrate the idea. There is unfortunately no style on this topic. So this is the problem with style. The first thing about style that we loved is that it did such a good job of explaining chemical reactions, but style just doesn't really do a very good job of evolution. There just weren't many there weren't many questions about this sort of stuff. So we're going to have to go back to relying on the textbook a little bit more than we usually did. So, but at least at the start, at least we had something we could talk about at the start. But yeah, speciation. We'll explain how speciation works. Before I go into speciation and making new species, I'm actually going to quickly finish up what we were doing last lesson. So last lesson I had you guys, we actually we're telling a bit of a story. And the story that we were telling was the history of evolution. And we were talking about how evolution started and who invented it. This was what we were doing Friday. So it was a bit more of a chill lesson because I was like, okay, we don't need to get through super huge amounts of content. So I'm just going to talk to you guys a little bit about history. We said that obviously evolution is, people always say Charles Darwin invented evolution. Charles Darwin did not invent evolution on his own. He would have done it with other people. And so there was this was a bit of a lesson to talk about those other people. We said that the idea was in place originally was the Earth is very young, so therefore it's like only like a couple of thousand years old, which that's still really old, a couple of thousand years old, but not like as old as millions of years is what we now think it is. And that things of the Earth existed since the start. So it's essentially just like, oh man, look at that horse. That horse must have been a horse way back at the very beginning. This also was really well done because it kind of really agreed with the religious texts at the time, which were like saying, yeah, God created everything. And so you could be like, yeah, all right, fine, God created everything, job done. But this is now replaced with the current theory of evolution, which is over Earth's long history, life originating from one organism, slowly changed into different species we see today by natural selection. So he gave this idea that, species slowly changed, okay? And not only that, but, species, there were lots of species, and some of them may still be around, and some of them may be gone. And yeah, the only way to have these species change over time is to make sure the Earth was around for a long time, a lot longer than 6,000 years, which is what they thought. So what we did was we looked at who came up with this idea. The first two people was Ezra and Darwin, who said, yeah, you know what, we all came from one species. We've just changed a bit. He was Charles Darwin's great grandfather, but he didn't really have any reason why or how it worked. He just looked at a bunch of animals and said, hey, look at like horses and zebras and giraffes. They're all really similar. So maybe they all came from the same ancient horse creature. And then if you look at all the cats, the lions, the tigers, they're all similar. So maybe they came from this ancient cat thing. Maybe this ancient cat thing and this ancient horse thing and this ancient dog thing were all related to this ancient four-legged thing, which was all related to this ancient. And eventually he said they all come back to this old single organism. Carolus Linnaeus, he doesn't really contribute directly to evolution, but he suggests, what, we're going to make it a bit easier. We're going to put things in boxes so it's easier to tell what's what. And so that makes it a bit, even though he didn't contribute directly to evolution, it made it a bit easier for us to be like, oh, look, these two things, like, as I said, the tiger and the lion, they're very similar because they're in the same family they're in the same genus, but they're not the same species, and so therefore we could actually have a way to sort of compare animals to each other in terms of the similarity. Good job, Linnaeus. Then we have these gents come along, and their whole thing was they asked when. So they were looking at, well, okay, I think the Earth's a bit older than we thought it was. Grab a look at these fossils. Grab a look at these levels of rock, and they actually said, you grab a look, you can actually see one animal die out, one species die out, and a new species show up. So that's what these guys suggested. James Hutton suggesting it's been around for a long time. Cuvier suggesting that the layers, the older the layer, so the deeper the layer, the older the life form. And then William Smith actually coming along and saying, guess what, these fossils of rock, we can look and see how animals are diurnal placed. And so we're actually on the precipice. We're on the edge of making a theory of evolution. Enter, this is, by the way, how it works. As this river deposits rock, animals and stuff can walk on to this rock, and then they can die out, and then they form bones, and then there's more rock gets formed on top. The tree can fall over and it can make a fossil, and the fossil gets put in the ground. And of course, the older, as I said, as you go downwards, you get older. So because these layers are deposited first. So then what you can see, is if there was like if you dug a hole down into the ground, you would see these layers. And in fact, if you ever have the opportunity to look at some roads that have been cut out, you can see layers. If you ever look at nature, you should be able to see in the earth while you're walking around. And like, if you ever allowed to go on nature walks again, look for layers in the earth, and that's actually an example of this sort of thing going on. And next, we're getting close towards the end of where we got up to last time. Is this going to happen to us? It will happen to you guys if you manage to die in a swamp, which is, in a tar-filled swamp in the middle of nowhere where your body can't be found. But it's unlikely that you guys will get fossilized. To become a fossil, I think it's a 1 in 1 million chance that an animal that dies becomes a fossil or something really small. It's very unlikely because, and then even if you are a fossil, it's hard to survive because I think we do get to talk about fossils a little bit more later. But yeah, it's like in order to become a fossil, you need to make sure that there is no air, because air rots things, and so air will essentially also decompose bones and stuff. So you want to make sure that there's no air or limited amounts of air, and so therefore the best way to do it is to have rocks actually penetrate your bones after you die, and then turn your bones into stronger rocks. That's actually, I've actually seen fossils in, believe it or not, in opal. So because opal penetrates the rock and makes it hard and stuff like that. Not 100% sure. I have to admit, fossilization is not my strong point. But if you think about mummification, right? If you think about mummification is a form of, it's almost a form of fossilization, because you're preserving the body. You're actually wrapping it up in, you're wrapping it up, and then you're putting that really tightly, and then you're putting that into an airtight container and stuff. So yeah, when they look at fossilized mummies and stuff, you can sort of see like the bones, the skin structure and stuff. And if you freeze something as well, so they've got these mammoths that are being frozen in ice, and then more ice is being built upon it because they're frozen in ice. Air gets to them, and so therefore, and same with humans. Humans can die if they die in ice. Then they can get layers upon layers of ice, and so even though they're dead, no air can get to them, so they don't really rot. So they stay sort of still. There's actually been evidence of fossils of humans that have died in the snow millions of years ago that we then found, and then what we were able to do is they were able to do a study of it and actually look at the contents of their stomach to find out what humans were eating like 4 million years ago, which is kind of interesting because then we could be like, oh, cool, what was the diet of a, what? So if you ever look at that question, you ever think, what did, you know, ancient man used to eat? Well, we could actually figure that out. It's kind of cool, interesting. Anyway, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, so he's what I was talking about before, proposes evolution, and he says, you know, you adapt to your environment by stretching, by moving, and that those adaptations are passed on. And then Auguste Weismann comes on and challenges that idea. And this is perfect because ultimately they're trying to explain evolution. They're trying to explain, yeah, we see these changes in fossils. We see these changes. What's causing them? So this is our first theory of evolution. And it sort of explains how the things evolve. Well, it was an attempt at an explanation how. And of course, Lamarck got it wrong because the answer was closely related to genetics. We didn't actually understand genetics at the time, but we did begin to figure out, well, some traits are inheritable and some traits aren't inheritable. So this gives us an idea of how did life change over time. But it wasn't Lamarck that actually came through in the end. It was actually these last two gentlemen that we attribute that changed Lamarck's theory of evolution to sort of fit to the current standing. And this is the next slide that I'd like you to copy down, which is this here. And this is where we got up to last time. So it'll take a little bit more time. Why do some species live? And this is a little bit better to deal with. This is a little bit better. This was Charles Darwin, and this was also another man, Alfred Wallace, and their theory of evolution, which essentially replaced Lamarck's theory of evolution and was a better theory of evolution. Because ultimately, they could answer some questions that Lamarck couldn't. Charles Darwin essentially said variations exist in nature to help organisms survive. Okay, how did he come up with this theory? Well, what he did was he noticed on the Galapagos Islands, which is some islands, I think, off the coast of South America, different variations of one bird's beak, of birds' beaks, birds' beaks. Variations of birds' beaks are adapted for different nuts, or essentially / food, because some of them were also adapted to eat bugs as well. And so what he was sort of saying is that, yeah, what Charles Darwin suggested is that these birds are different, but they don't inherit these traits. The reason that they inherit, why some species live, is sort of what was Alfred Wallace sort of proposed. And Alfred Wallace asked the question, why do some species live? But he goes, well, you know, it makes sense that, you know, why do some species live and why do some species die out? Like, why does evolution occur in the first place? It's like, it's, you know, and ultimately he came up with this idea of survival of the fittest. And so he contacted Darwin, and together they created this theory of evolution, that the fittest animal or plant is the one that survives. And that's the one that is best suited for the environment. Because if you're best suited for the environment, then you're going to survive. So it's not that you adapt. It's not that Lamarck was wrong. It's not that you change over time and you pass your genes onto your children. You just pass your genes onto your children. But it just so happens that if you are the one that survives, you're more likely to pass your gene onto your children. And of course, Darwin was noticing that, yeah, you know what, there is still random variations. And these random variations can sort of guide evolution. And it would take a while before we started to look at how DNA works and understanding that, and understanding this theory that, you know, that DNA can mutate and that's how we get it. But ultimately, that's how we sort of ended up with this sort of idea. So yeah, so I'd like you to jot this down here. Maybe you don't have to write down every single word. I'm definitely going to keep this up. The pictures I've decided to put down the bottom is a bird, because of course I thought I'd put a bird down for Charles Darwin, because again, it was Darwinians. He based his theory a lot on these types of birds that he saw on the Galapagos Islands. And also for Alfred Wallace, I've got a weightlifting person who's really fit, because it's survival of the fittest. So I guess, yeah, I can't really, I'm going to change the slide in about maybe, we'll go for 90 seconds, so like a minute 30. So I'll give you guys some time to write this down, because there's a lot of text on the slide. So Charles Darwin essentially publishes this. I'll tell you the story. So Charles Darwin goes to the Galapagos Islands, comes up with this great theory of evolution, right? And tells the world, and no, he actually doesn't. Get this, he writes down this amazing theory of evolution, right? He writes it down in this book called On the Origin of Species, and he sits on this book. He actually goes and he says, he thinks, you know what, I'm not too sure about this yet. I'm gonna not publish it. I'm just gonna leave this book here, and just when I'm ready, I will publish it, just in case. I think maybe he was scared that people might judge him or something like that. This is fine, but then Alfred Wallace sends him a letter and says, "Hey, yo, I've been thinking about this idea. What do you think?" And he goes, "Shit, someone has just come up with my idea. I've got this book that I have never published, that someone's now about to steal it if I don't publish it." So he ends up having to publish the Origin of Species with a letter from Wallace in it. And it's like, I was like, yeah, it's kind of a bit of an evidence. And this actually occurs a fair bit in science. For some reason, scientists come up with these amazing ideas, and then they don't necessarily feel confident enough to share them. So therefore they wait, and then sometimes someone comes along and steals their idea or comes up with it if someone is more confident. So yeah, Charles Darwin also had this idea of survival of the fittest, but you know, the species that fits into a particular niche is the one that survives and passes on its genes. And slowly over time, there is a slow, gradual change. But that's not because of, you know, it's adapting. It's because of, you know, just random, you know, mutations. I think they probably understood the idea of mutations, probably just didn't understand what caused them. And it's probably just like, well, some of these mutations have helped these birds out, and so on and so forth. So he did publish it. On the Origin of Species is probably one of the most important books written in science. So yeah, it'd be different. It would definitely be interesting to look at that book. I've told you guys in the past that I would really love to look at. You can actually go and you can actually see, if you like organize it properly, to see the original copy of the Isaac Newton's Principia, or the principles of physics, and so I'd love to see that. Or the Origins of Species, that'd be a good second. Oh my god, like important books like that. So that's how the theory of evolution came about, based off the previous people. Ultimately, these gentlemen couldn't come up with this theory without first having an understanding of what species are, without having an understanding, without knowing what species are. Let me go back. They couldn't have come up with their theory without having a long amount of time for evolution to occur, rather than, you know, just changing over one's lifetime. They couldn't really explain it without an understanding of how are these changes actually occurring, because they were occurring because of hereditable traits. And that's why they essentially came up with their theory. And their theory answered, well, this is why some species die out. This is why we have extinction. This is why we see some species not existing anymore, because They couldn't survive. They were not the fittest. They didn't fit into the evolution. I'm actually going to talk about this in a separate slide today, but this is actually Darwin's finches. This is actually, I'm not sure if this is, I think this might be an idealized drawing of what he saw, but what he did was he saw all these finches and he said, these finches look really, really similar, but you could he sort of started to figure out that their beaks had been adapted to the food that they were eating. So even though these finches are the same, their beaks are different. So number 3 and number 4, they said, well, these guys eat bugs because they've got small beaks that are used to stab bugs or used to get into holes to pick bugs out of holes and stuff. Whereas 1 and 2, they would be eating nuts. So they've got a big beak used to crack nuts because it could put a lot of force down. And so he was able to say these have adapted to suit the environment and to suit the food available in their environment. And so that's how Darwin's finches is essentially what led him to come up with this theory of evolution. But because they were so similar, he suggested that they must have come from one species, one original older species, and slowly adapted over time to these different conditions. So here's an interesting question then. These animals are adapting to these different conditions. How do you make a new species? How do you call these are 4 species of bird? How can you tell that these species are different? So let's actually talk about that. Firstly, and that's what we're going to be doing today's lesson. So I've got a couple of slides. We're going to go through them as we see how we go through them. I'm not going to go through everything in speciation today. It sort of got to the point where I was making these slides. I thought, you know what? I think I've already spoken too much, but I think this will probably, I think I've done a couple of slides of it, but it should be okay. Firstly, we're going to look at species. By the way, this is thanks to Carolus Linnaeus for coming up with this theory here, but essentially a species is a group of organisms that can breed to produce offspring. They can also breed. That might seem really random, but I'll explain why that's important. So all dogs are the same species. Now, it's interesting, right? When you look at a dog, if you look at a sausage dog or a pit bull, or if you look at a Rottweiler or a Greyhound, you look at a Fox Terrier or a Poodle, they all look very, very, very different. But they are all still the same species. You can still breed them, and that's why you breed a Cavalier and a Poodle, you get something like a Cavoodle, which has got some cross between the traits. But that dog is offspring. It can produce offspring, and that little puppy, that Cavoodle puppy, can eventually have other dogs as well. That's how you can tell they're the same species. But not, but if you grab a look at these 2 things here, these are 2 different species. They look very similar, but they are different species. One of them is, I can tell that because one is Canis lupus and one of them is Canis latrans. And so therefore, they might be able to breed, but their children might not be able to produce, probably won't be able to produce offspring. Same is true. They might not even be able to breed. They may not even be able to have puppies because they're different species. Another example that I saw on the internet was you can actually breed a horse with actually, was it a donkey? I think it was a donkey. You can actually breed a donkey with a zebra. Now, because ultimately they are both still you know, horse-like creatures. You can actually get a baby, but that baby is sterile. It can't actually make other zonkey babies. So that's not a thing that can occur. So that's how you can tell that there's 2 species, is that if you can make children, and those children can then make more children, because you can maybe breed them and get a child, but that's not going to start a new generation if they can't further breed. Now, I put this last bit here because I was a bit interested and I knew that I was going to get questions from someone. Humans and apes are related, but they're not the same species. Okay, that means that we can't have offspring with apes. Sure. And so, yeah, and that's because we're in the same family or genus, but we're not the same. And these two are the same genus, but we're not necessarily in the same species. No, don't worry about copying the table thing. You don't have to copy the table thing. This is just an example of Carlos Linnaeus' system. If you guys remember, hopefully from Year 7 Science: Kingdom, Phylum, Class, Order, Family, Genus, Species, Group. Kingdom, Animalia, Chordata, Mammalia, Carnivora, Canidae, Canis, and then Canis latrans and Canis lupus. The grey wolf is, and then of course you've also got the common dog, which is Canis familiaris, which is familiar, which means common. So it's actually, you know, our version of the dog, if you ever wanted to know. I'm a massive dog person, so I try to use dog. I try to use dog examples wherever I can. Let's keep going. So this is the idea of what a species is. The reason why I'm defining a species is because we're going to talk about how different species are created. So it's a really good idea to start off with the definition of what a species is. A species is a group of animals that, you know, that can have children. Those children can have children, so you can have great-grandchildren and grandchildren, great-grandchildren. So let's go with, well, what is speciation then? Speciation is when a new species is formed. This can happen in a number of ways, and we're going to talk about one of those ways shortly. We can tell speciation occurred if new populations of organisms can no longer successfully breed with old populations. So let's grab a look at, actually, let's just give you a second to write this down because this is our definition of speciation. As I said, we're making some new species. Oops, sorry guys. Okay. Now I can start to talk about this stuff. So let's go look at the picture on the left while you guys are copying down. The picture on the left is called the ancestor finch. This is related to Darwin's finches. He looked at these finches and he said, well, these finches have all come from one common ancestor. I can tell because they're very, very similar. But I can sort of tell that their beaks have sort of, over time, changed to fit into their environment, probably because, you know, they're trying to fit into certain parts of the land. And I think because he was looking at the Galapagos Islands, I think there's a list of islands, you could go from island to island and you can look at the same finch. And so if there's an island which has a lot of bugs on it, then you're going to have more of the top, you know, have the finch evolve into the top one. If there are not many bugs, but there's lots of tree nuts, then they're probably, or seeds, they're going to probably evolve into the finch down the bottom. Now, because and what will happen is if he was able to maybe get a cage and capture one of these finches and try to breed it with one of these finches, it wouldn't work because they were different species. It wouldn't actually work. You wouldn't be able to get any eggs or any children from it. And even if you were to take this one and try and breed it with its ancestor, it still wouldn't work. Assuming that its ancestor is still around, still wouldn't work because you wouldn't be able to get they wouldn't be able to get children. So that's how you can tell that therefore this is a new species, is because you can't breed it with anything aside from its own self. And so yeah, that's what Darwin sort of proposed, and Charles Darwin was sort of proposing, great, these birds are unique to their own environment. They form their own species from this older species. But if you look at all these things, it's not because it's not because one bird, he suggested it wasn't because one bird could, eat nuts, so therefore its children started to get this adaptation, like Lamarck said. He was just saying, well, no, it's just because over time this trait was preferable, and so therefore it was evolved, whereas the other ones died out. So that's what speciation talks about. Now, what we're going to do for the rest of this lesson is talk a little bit about what are these ways that we can actually cause a new species to show up. So there are some ways that we can cause new species to show up. And that's, first one is called phyletic evolution. Now, phyletic evolution, we're only going to touch on this briefly. That's why there's only one quick little word here. Phyletic evolution is when one species changes over time and becomes a new species. The example here is the epicus that essentially evolves into the modern horse over time. And this is natural evolution. Humans probably played a role in the last little bit with artificial selection, but in the beginning it was probably just phyletic evolution. And this is evolves over time. So what that means is that this species can't breed with this one or this one can't breed with this one, and so on and so forth. And the idea is that it slowly evolves. So if you were to get this horse at the end, you wouldn't be able to breed this horse with any of the horses at the beginning. They're just too, and form a new species, they're just too different. Is that a typo? This is when one species changes over time and becomes a new species. No, it's not a typo. I don't think it is. Unless I've yeah, someone said asked if I made a typo somewhere. I may have, but I can't see it. I'm just reading it here. Phyletic. Yep, that's what's called, phyletic. Pretty sure it's called phyletic. But yeah, phyletic evolution. So this is the first type, but this is actually not the one that I wanted to focus on, because yeah, sure, we can talk about this. We can talk about what changes. This is probably going to be caused by one massive change for a particular, and like all of the species of that type will slowly adapt. Maybe in this one, like it looks like the horses are getting taller, so that could be, and they're probably also getting faster because they're getting better legs. So maybe they're trying to avoid getting attacked by predators, and so therefore the animals that are moving faster are less likely to get attacked by predators. Maybe because they're taller, they can eat food a bit easier. They have more access to different types of grass and stuff like that, and so therefore that's another evolutionary pressure. Selection pressure. So that might be some reasons why these things evolved the way they did. But phyletic evolution is just one species changing to another over time, and then you can actually see this in fossil records. What we're going to talk about is a different type of evolution. We're going to talk about spend a little bit more time talking about divergent evolution. And so I'm going to do that with this image here. And this image here, we're going to explore this sort of land here, and we're going to like talk about, well, what's going to happen here, how is evolution going to occur, and what's this going to mean for evolution. So let's say on this particular island, should we give the island a name?
Yeah, give it a name, sir.
Okay, well, I don't know.
Luna.
Luna?
I don't know. I'm just making up. That's the first thing that came to my mind. Ah, you're naming it Talik?
Talicandia. Okay. So you got this. We've got this island called Talicandia. Well, let's just put some animals on this island. We're gonna and we've got this rocky part in the north here, and we've got this like grassy kind of trees on the south of the island, this little lake here. And so let's just put some animals, and we've got this river as well, so this cute little river here. And so let's put some animals on here. We're gonna put some birds. Birds are gonna fly around, and they're gonna fly around in the mountains because maybe there's some grass and seeds there, but they're also gonna fly around in the they're also gonna fly around on the amongst the let's throw in a whale. Yeah, I should put a whale in, and they're gonna swim around in the swim around. Sorry, Alex, you distracted me. They're gonna swim. They're gonna eat all these nuts and stuff like that in the grass and stuff. Let's throw in some. Let's throw in some mammals. Let's put in some mice. And so they're gonna say these mice are gonna live in the mountains as well as they're gonna live in the grass and stuff. And so they're gonna eat all these mice and stuff like that. And let's put in some beetles and stuff. There's not gonna be many beetles in the mountains, so we're just going to mostly put our beetles and insects down in the grass section. Okay, now over time, what happens to Talicandia is we actually end up with a bit of a situation. This river is slowly going to carve its way through the surface of the rock. Okay, and what's going to happen is we're actually going to have this situation here show up. Let me see if I can show. We're going to focus on this mouse. Now, the mice here are in all of the different parts of the island. So we're going to see what happens to these mice over time. So what we're going to do is first we're going to simplify the island. So we're going to get rid of all these trees and stuff in the mountains because I just want you guys to focus on it. Now we know the top part is mostly mountains and stuff, and the bottom part is mostly like grass and trees and stuff like that. And then let's say is over time, and we're not talking about over time, we're talking about millions of years, we actually get this river building up more and more and more and more and more until it gets to the point now where the river is so much that you can almost call these two separate islands. So we've got Talicandia, and then we've got North Talicandia. Now, the property prices in North Talicandia are going to be more expensive because it's called North Talicandia, which makes it sound fancy. So if you want to buy a house, yeah. So we've got like it's almost like divided into two separate islands now. You could call it North Talicandia and South Talicandia, but it doesn't matter. Now, here's the thing, right? These two islands are very separate, right? And so what you could do is we could have like these rats here. These can't get across to this side of the island because there's now a massive river in the way. These rats can't get over to this side of the island because there's a massive river in the way. The birds can. The birds can do whatever they want. Now there's no insects on this side of the island, so so that's going to be a bit of a problem. The birds can do whatever they want because they can fly over the river. But yeah, and we'll just pretend that these rats can't do it because they can't swim for that big of a distance. They'll just die. So what's going to happen now? Now we've got these two sections of the island. We've got North Telecandia and South Telecandia. What's going to happen to the animals in these different regions? Well, this is where we enter our idea of speciation. All of the rats are the same species, all of the birds are the same species, all of the insects are the same species. But now they've been separated. They have been isolated. And so what we're going to see is we're going to see this happen, right? And I've now done this. Over time, the different mice are going to evolve differently. Let's talk about why this might occur. So let's actually have a look at what those might look like. So in the north, we can sort of see that the mice become like this. You might say, well, what the heck is that? That doesn't look like a mouse anymore. Well, let's grab a look at some of the features here. What I've tried to do as a bit of a feature is I've tried to give it like thicker fur. And the reason it's got thicker fur is because it's in the mountains. It's in the cold mountains. So therefore, if it's in the cold mountains, it needs to make sure that it stays warm. So natural selection will make thick fur be a pressure that will be an advantage. So over millions of years, about millions of years, the mice with thicker fur are going to survive more and have more children. So then that encourages more mice to be formed. The next thing we could talk about here, what the next sort of thing that this has got is it's closer to white. And that sort of makes sense because why it would have be white is because there's probably going to be lots of snow. Remember, we're in the mountains here, so therefore snow, and that's going to be camouflage, and that's going to be really good for it. Now, one of the reasons why this mouse needs a lot of camouflage is that its main food source of insects are not here. So this mouse has had to evolve to become some kind of predator. And why we can tell it it's a predator because it's got claws / sharp teeth. And that's because it doesn't have insects it can eat. The only thing it can eat is the bird. So it's going to maybe evolve. And so maybe one mouse learns how to eat like a baby bird and stuff. And so it survives. And so therefore more of these mice start to survive. And so they start to get these adaptations for thick fur and white and their predators and stuff like that. And yeah, by the way, who was saying something before, by the way, now you're glad that I didn't call this like a mouse looks like a rose from dead. Are you lucky that I didn't call this mouse Alex? I didn't think of no, I'm not gonna do that. That'd be way too cool. Let's look at the other one. So the other mouse, let's see if this comes in. Yeah, perfect. The other mouse, right? I'm not calling it out. That's just too mean. I wouldn't even Mousicus, Alexis, whatever. Anyway, point is that this one down the bottom here is a bit different. Now the one down the bottom has evolved as well. This one has got a darker brown. And that might be because, again, that might be also because of camouflage. There might be more dark brown soil, because if you think about the soil, it's probably going to be closer to dark brown and so on and so forth. And the other thing as well, it's got a long nose. And the reason it's got a long nose is because long noses are great when it comes to eating insects. And so these guys can eat insects, and of course they can probably also eat a fair bit of the but it doesn't need claws. So claws aren't something that it evolves, and it doesn't need sharp teeth because it's eating insects and nuts and stuff. So it's not preferable for it to gain those traits. So therefore, it doesn't gain those traits. But what we can look at is that we have now created two different species from one species. One species has become two species. And that's actually got a name. We call this divergent evolution. And this is sort of divergent, meaning making multiple, making things divergent. The divergent evolution or branching evolution is where one population is separated or isolated into groups. This is usually done by geographical changes. Now, it's not always done by geographical changes. And I watched a video about trying to understand this to make sure I could better explain it. They went through some really complicated reasons why sometimes it's not. But we're just going to stick to the basics here, which is, like for example, one of the random examples. Well, let's just say that your animals only breed in the springtime. If you've got animals that only breed in the summertime, then they'll be isolated from the other species, even though they're in the same area. But we're going to stick to just geographical changes because that's easy to understand. In this case, moving continents or mountains forming, or in this case, the river that got created was what split up our mice populations. Because of the river, there was no way that one mouse population could move down and mate with another mouse population. If these two populations could have mated, then they wouldn't have changed so much. They wouldn't have like adapted to their specific environment. They could also move around and experience different environments. And so therefore making it so that it's not like needed to be. Now, different selection pressures led to different new species. In this case, the selection pressure that made the scary rat half dead thing was the cold climate and the food source, whereas the one that made this one the way it maybe did is because of the food source. So because of their different food sources, they became different looking. And of course, their different climates also affected how they looked and how they would evolve. Now, this does occur in nature. Look, pardon me, I'm stretching. This does occur in nature a lot. You can actually see this occurring, or you can't see this occurring. One of the ones that they do a lot is they look at really isolated places. So they look at like so Australia is really interesting when it comes to this, because obviously Australia used to be connected to all the continents, but it's drifted away. And so because it's drifted away, we've got in Australia a lot of species that have been isolated from other species for a very, very, very long time. And so therefore those species have evolved. If you look at, like, for example, we don't have wolves in Australia, really. We have dingoes, we don't have wolves, and dingoes are like, dingoes and wolves came from the same original species. So if you look at wolves and dingoes, you can say, well, what the heck happened here? It's like, well, their evolution has diverged. Dingoes have got like brown fur and they're, you know, a little bit smaller, so they're adapted to the hot climate of Australia. Whereas wolves have got thick coats and they're white because they've usually adapted, or grey because they've adapted to the mountainous regions, and so therefore they've changed over time. And there are other things that can cause animals to adapt. I know that I usually refer to fur color, and I usually refer to like claws and stuff like that, but that's just because they're easy to understand and easy to explain. But yeah, that's what essentially, if you isolate stuff, if you look at the Galapagos Islands, all of those islands were once together, but because they split up, the birds have had to, you know, adapt to the environment that they're in. So that's why their beaks changed over time. It's essentially they created new species because of that, and so on and so forth. So let's now talk about let's do this here. So this is the last slide, I think. Yeah, I think this might be the last slide. Or yeah, I think it might be the last slide. So, but we'll talk about it, and then I'm gonna. Yeah, this is probably gonna be it for today because I feel like I've talked enough. We'll talk about adaptive radiation, which sounds like some kind of deadly radiation, but it's not. Adaptive radiation is when divergent evolution of one species results in the formation of many species that are adapted to a variety of environments. So it's where if you take if you take one species and then you that can adapt into lots of different species. I guess more than just two. So if you grab a look on the right here, Australian marsupials are examples show adaptive radiation as they adapted from a common ancestor, but due to different selection pressures and different characteristics have emerged. So if you look at the Tasmanian devil, the koala, the bush mouse, and the sugar glider, I'm gonna guess, I think that's all the names of these. I'm not sure if it's actually called a bush mouse, but yeah. These all would have come from the same animal. And they might not look like it. You might look at the bush mouse and Tasmanian devil and go, oh my God, there's nothing similar. But if you sort of look, I guess, their eyes, their ear position, their size is very different. Their fur color is very different. But, you know, that's probably because of the environment. Tasmanian devil may have had less predators, so therefore was able to grow larger. Whereas the bush mouse, you know, has a lot more predators, so probably had to stay small, so therefore that's why. And these things change to adapt to their particular environment. No, I can't remember. So this is just it's called radiation because it's one animal that radiates to different animals over time. And of course, this is happening over millions of years. And yeah, if you look at the Tasmanian devil, it makes sense. So that's just occurs in Tasmania. So Tasmania is isolated from mainland Australia. So it makes sense why Tasmanian devils evolved there, but maybe they don't exist in the rest of the country. And that's where you can look at these things. You can look at like two countries that may have used to have joined millions of years ago, but have drifted apart. So if you look at like Australia and like Fiji and Indonesia, you could probably find a fair couple of things that have evolved between those two. Look at Japan and China, there's probably differences there. I think like the red panda is an example of that, but I'm not sure. Like, I don't quote me on that one. So yeah, ladies and gents, well, I'm going to skip over some. So this is essentially two of the main ideas of evolution, of speciation. The first is divergent evolution. So yeah, so the first was the first type of evolution that we talked about was phyletic evolution, which is one thing becomes another thing. And the second one we talked about was divergent evolution. Now there are different ways and then we talked about adaptive radiation, which is still divergent. Now there are a couple of other parts that we could talk about. We're not going to talk about convergent evolution today because it's, you know, figured that I've already talked to you guys for a while. Co-evolution is like, these are not convergent and co-evolution. Convergent evolution is not actually a type of speciation. It's just a different type of evolution, and neither is co-evolution is also not a type of speciation. It's just a different way that animals evolve. And then extinction is a good thing to talk about as well. So these are the next couple of ideas that I want to talk about, and I might talk about them on Friday. We've only got one lesson on Friday because guess what? The last lesson's cancelled like normal because it's the last day of school. So I'm just going to be going through these three. I'm only going to be going through 1, 2, 3 slides on Friday, 4 slides on Friday, and then that'll be it. Obviously, there's nothing written here at the moment because I haven't done it. What I'd like you guys to do today, though, for the last little bit, because I'm done talking, is, and I'm going to put this on the, is I'd like to answer questions 3 and 4 of 3.4 on in the textbook. Now, if you don't have the textbook, I can link that. I can maybe cut those questions out and send it to you or something like that.